ahead and get started with our webinar today. We're excited to have Emily Robinson from the Texas Education Agency joining us today. Emily has been kind enough to provide webinars for us in the past, and she does a wonderful job about giving updates specifically to our deaf and hard of hearing community and educational services specifically for our kids in deaf education across the state of Texas. Emily, don't want to mess up your official title at Texas Education Agency, so I'll let you give that title when you introduce yourself. I don't want to mess that up. I do want to mention to everyone that we are utilizing the webinar format today versus Zoom meetings. So nobody will be on camera other than Emily, our interpreter, and Teresa and I will turn our cameras off here in just a second. If you do have a question for Emily, we do encourage you to put that in the chat box, and Teresa will be monitoring those questions throughout, so we can be sure to get that directed to Emily. As a quick introduction, I want to introduce myself to you. My name is Michaela Hamaker. I am the Texas Hands and Voices Guide by Your Side coordinator. I'm also a mother to two deaf, well, one young adult, one teenager. So I'm a parent as well as a professional working with other parents and professionals in all things related to deaf and hard of hearing. So I'm happy to be here with you guys. I would also like to mention our funding partner. The Guide by Your Side is generously funded by the statewide outreach center at the Texas School for the Deaf, and we are very thankful for their funding of our program, as well as funds from Education Service Center 11. So thank you very much to our funding partners. Teresa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi everyone, this is Teresa Banda. I am the Executive Director of Texas Hands and Voices. And like Michaela, I'm a parent too. I'm a mom to 4 kids, the youngest of whom is deaf. And I just want to welcome every one of you to here today. I appreciate y'all taking the time to join us and learn from Emily. So we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is Michaela. I'm going to turn it over to Emily. And Emily, whenever you're ready for me to share the screen, you let me know.
You can go ahead and share the screen. All right, are we good to go? We ready? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Robinson, and I'm with the Texas Education Agency, TEA. My job title really is, I have 2. One is the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Program Manager, as well as the State Director of Regional Day Program for the Deaf. I've been here at this agency for 4 years now, and really, I'm just excited to be here with all of you today, and hopefully that you can, grab your lunch and enjoy your lunch and watch this webinar with me. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you've noticed on the title slide, the sentence at the bottom says Office of Special Populations and Monitoring. And that is our division. And so we really have 2 separate parts of that division, the special populations, and that's for special education, English speaking students, etc. And we also have the monitoring, and they do all of the monitoring for our schools to ensure that they comply with these special education standards. And so we are included in one big office. And I just wanted to make sure that that was clear to everyone, is that the special education is under our office. Okay, next slide, please. And And so this is the agenda for the webinar today. We have two areas here that we're going to focus on. The first is legislative updates. We have several laws that will be mentioned throughout the presentation today, and I will explain a bit about each of those. The HB House Bill 548 is dealing with the importance of language acquisition and assessments for deaf and hard of hearing students from ages 0 to 8. We will also talk about House Bill 3261, and that is related to our statewide assessment, which is the STAR test. And we have some updates related to that. And then State Bill 1716, that is special education supplemental services, and that's related to supplemental services into special education and related to COVID. So we will provide some updates on that as well. And then this is not a law, however, it is a rule. It is the Texas Education Code, the TEC 30.083 statewide plan. And I will be discussing the special updates in regards to that. And then we will switch gears over to the eligibility process for deaf and hard of hearing services. And there are 3 bullet points that we will talk about: eligibility for special education, placement, and communication needs. Are we ready to jump in? Okay, next slide, please. So the legislative updates. So House Bill 548. I wanted to discuss the importance of language assessments. The pictures that you see on the slide, they are clips from the infographic that I have and that the ECI, Early Childhood Intervention Department, they have created this for the HB 548. And I wanted to explain that to y'all and what is the importance of language assessments and why do we need them. So we know that the language assessments themselves are critical to providing data to help families to help their child to make sure that their child is on track with their language assessments. And if the child is behind or has any gaps, no matter how small they are, we want to catch those gaps so that we can address them. So as a parent and guardians, this can help your child in their journey of developing language by giving them the opportunity. Every year, the school will ask if we can go ahead and assess your child for the HB 548, so that can give them opportunity to go ahead and assess your child's language. And that permission gives the school the ability to actually give the assessment to your child. And that assessment data will help us make some educational decisions as a team so that we can discuss how to make sure that your child is on track for language development. And the data that is collected is confidential. Your child will not be labeled or tracked at any of the state level or anything of that. This is just to share information as a statewide need to see where we are standing in relation to language acquisition.
Hey, Emily, this is Teresa. There are 2 questions, and maybe you can address these. The first one, what are your thoughts on structured reading program for deaf kids? Do you have information on deaf, hard of hearing, and learning disabilities? And how do we identify learning disabilities in deaf kids and what services are offered?
That is a very good question. That is the million-dollar question, if you will. Statewide, I would not be able to answer that. But for the language assessment committee, we do have a group of professionals that discuss and come up with decisions and bring them up. However, currently we are collecting data and we don't want to make any decisions related to curriculum or any programs to make improvements just yet. First, we want to collect that data. It's about 2 or 3 years of cumulative data. And from that, we will make some decisions. At the same time, we're also collecting information in regards to different programs that we currently have. I think we have 53 regional day school programs currently, and what they are using for their curriculums, for reading development, etc. So we're gathering all that information to see where we're standing and get ready to start making program decisions for the future. But thank you for that question. I will keep that in mind, and I'll bring it up with our committee as well.
Okay. Hey, Emily, this is Teresa again. I've got one more question for you. Well, it's another two-part question. Do we have statistics on the literacy outcome of deaf kids in school? What's the reading score for different grades for our deaf, hard of hearing kids, and how does it par with general education students?
That is another good question as well. So for the first part, currently we don't have any data on specifically literacy development and where the kids are. However, our assessment that we're using currently for this purpose, it has a literacy component built into it. And that's something that we've been looking at in the future, because right now it's not very strongly added into our current assessment. We're right now currently in the process of breaking down our assessments and making sure that we collect the appropriate data. And then secondly, how to compare that with just the general public and gen ed population. We look at the STAR results. However, we know that a lot of our deaf and hard of hearing students, the STAR assessment itself is not an appropriate match for us to be able to compare with the gen ed and general public and the deaf and hard of hearing population. So you have to give the same assessment essentially to be able to make that comparison. So currently we don't have that data unless you want to use the STAR assessment as that marker, but I don't want to use that as the marker currently.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So again, these are just clips from the infographic that I took. The whole infographic I will show at the end of the PowerPoint. And also we are getting ready. Currently, we are in the progress of making a more accessible version of that. And we have learned that it is not accessible to some individuals. And so we're trying to make this more accessible, and then we'll be sending that out to folks. And we are also making the infographic accessible in Spanish as well. Okay, so now jumping over to HB 3261, which is the STAR. And I don't know if any of you have been hearing about the STAR test and that we're changing it to being offered online. And we want all the kids who are able to take the test online to do so. And we're starting that in year 2022, 2023, and that is the next school year. But I did want you all to understand that the STAR assessment will be available online from grades 3 to 8 at EOC for the end of course assessments as well. and for Spanish assessments and accommodation assessments. However, the STAR Alternative 2 assessment, that is still will be provided as paper and pencil, a written physical test, and it's depending on the students' ARD decisions if they should take the STAR Alt 2 so that they can take that exam on paper. However, the new changes that will be made, we will be eliminating the standalone for grade 4 and 7 for the written assessments. We've had them for quite a while, but now we're going to change them to a standalone assessment. But instead, we have decided to incorporate that in the reading assessment. So writing will be included for all grade levels. It will not be standalone anymore. And then the last box talks about accessibility features. Those are still available and still an option for people to sign the test administration directions. That means they can interpret the directions into ASL. And that is still an option. And that is even for online assessment as well. We can provide that. And then also, if students need specific supports, such as they want the test to be signed to them, we will call that designated supports. So, and we have that as signed or oral administration. And we know that the test currently right now will just have a computer robotic voice that explains the instructions, but that does not always accommodate or match our deaf students. So we can request to have the test be an orally administered. And that means that an individual will stand in with the student and read the directions so that they can read their lips. We also provided an American Sign Language for the STAR assessment. And what you would do is you would click and it would have a video that pops up that signs the instructions in American Sign Language. So maybe sometimes the students don't completely understand ASL and they need clarification. They can have, perhaps they use local signs that their instructor tends to use that might not show up on the test. So you can have that person in there as long as that is included in their IEP plan. Are there any questions related to the STAR? Okay, we're going to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now State Bill 1716, that is the Supplemental Special Education Services, SSES. This recently passed to where we got more money to expand this program. And we recognized that it was beneficial to so many families due to COVID and the pandemic, schools shutting down. Some kids were not able to receive services or have access. And so it's the same eligibility criteria. They have to be enrolled in a Texas public school. They have to be in grade levels pre-K through 12th grade. And also they have to be a student with a disability that is currently served through special education. Those are the three criteria that they must meet. And the deadline to apply has been extended because the passing of State Bill 1716. So we were able to extend that deadline. But we still have a limited number of accounts. So it's kind of still under the concept of first come, first serve. If you haven't applied and your child meets the eligibility criteria, please go ahead and apply, because the students can get special services. Perhaps they can have additional tutoring to catch them up due to COVID, so that they can be brought up. You can request services for that, or educational materials. We have seen some families get adaptive equipment in the classroom, and especially for sensory related things. We also had a family get an iPad purchase to help them. There's just so many different resources and things that you can get access to. And I really encourage you to go look at that and see if it's an appropriate match for your students. I also did want to mention there are some questions coming up related to students who are in the 18 plus program, if they're eligible for this. And as long as they haven't graduated, they can apply for this program. If they have already graduated, then they can't apply for this program. And I also got questions related to private schools, but they have to be enrolled in a Texas public school. And again, we've seen so many benefits come from this program, and we really want to encourage our families to apply. And if you have any questions for your local school district, or if they have any more information, I'd be happy to share that information with them. And we also have a link to the website, and I will show that at the end of the presentation so that you can get more information if you're interested. Are there any questions?
Hi, Emily. This is Michaela. I know we didn't have a question here in the chat, but we have gotten lots of questions from our Guide by Your Side team, who is supporting families. We encouraged a lot of our families to apply for this funding back even, I believe it was in November, before or when the application became live to apply. And they had been reaching out to us with questions about when they would receive their account with that money to be able to spend. A lot of them have said that they thought that they would hear by January. Some have not. Could you give us a little bit of an update on when they might expect to see their account become active, or if they've been approved to receive this funding?
Yes, right now it's only a team of 3 people that are doing this, and they are really trying their best to get all of the accounts approved. But I have heard that they are getting close to approving and setting up all the accounts by the end of January. I mean, that was last week, I think. If you've noticed that your account still has not been approved, or you haven't gotten any information, please let me know so that I can nudge and ask about that, so that I can get you an update. And it's really, I'd be happy to help anyone that needs it. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next slide. Now we're going to switch over to the Texas Education Code, TEC 30.083. So this is our deaf and hard of hearing statewide plan. Right now, we're in the process of reviewing the data. We want to develop new indicators as well, so that we can make some improvements to our current plan. So right now we're looking for parents to be involved. We have a plethora of educators and community members, but we really would like the parents to be involved and have your child involved as well. So please It only takes 2 minutes of your time to fill out the survey. The link is right here on this slide. And really, it's just basically asking for your interests. If you are interested in becoming a committee member, and we would love to have y'all involved. Right now, we're trying to redesign the plan, and that will require a lot of work from the community, educators, and parents working together so that we can improve the program for our deaf and hard of hearing services for the students statewide. It is crucial. The survey is open until February 18th. Then we will close it and we will publish more information or send out more information after that. Any questions about that? I see a chat popped up, some notification.
Yeah, this is Michaela. So they are saying they're not able to click on that link. Yes, so I just want to address that really quickly. You can't click on this link as it's live in the presentation, but I will follow up with everyone after today's webinar in an email that includes Emily's PowerPoint, and from that PowerPoint, you'll be able to click those links live. So I'll be sure to follow up with that information, and we will also be able, we'll send that link to you in the chat box in just a few moments. So you guys, just in case you don't see it in your email or it goes to spam before you can, we want to encourage you guys to be a part of that. So we'll also put that in the chat box for you guys to copy and paste that, or even do it while we're finishing up. So I'll make sure that gets done.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate having y'all involved in the committee. That would be great. Okay, now go to the next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the eligibility process for DHHS services. So this is eligibility for special education services to determine if a child who is deaf and hard of hearing is identified as disabled. The evaluation date that we will be collecting will be reviewed by a lot of people on the determination team, so we can determine the student's eligibility based on otological and auditorial impairments. Now we actually use just the term deaf and hard of hearing. But they must have one of the three: otological, that is an assessment that is done by an ENT, an ear, nose, and throat doctor. The other is an audiological test by a licensed audiologist. And that evaluation should include a description of the implications of hearing loss. They have various scenarios for that, and either with or without amplification. And then the third is communication. It's a communication assessment, and they assess the child's use of communication. I mean, it can be just several types of communication. It could be oral, auditorial, finger spelling, using sign language, gestures, really any way that the child uses to communicate that is actually language. There is no child out there that has absolutely no language at all. That is not true. Children do have some sort of language. It might look like a traditional form of language or communication. So we need to put down something for the child's communication, facial expressions, gestures, really anything. So best practices we tend to see for the communication assessment is usually done with an SLP, a speech language pathologist, and a teacher of the student who is deaf and hard of hearing. So they will work together to fill out that communication assessment. And that is the first step of the eligibility process. We have to determine these three areas: the autological evaluation, an audiological evaluation, and communication evaluation. And then next slide. So now we will be determining from those three, we will determine the educational needs of the student. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, requires local education agencies, LEAs, which is essentially the school districts, to do a full evaluation of the student in all areas where they suspect disability. The evaluation itself is very comprehensive. It has to impact every single area of disability. And that will help us be able to recognize the child's special needs and what services that we can assign for those needs. Their disability could be different from the services that are provided. So we have to assess every single area. For example, the functional and development assessment on the academic needs, the functional, development, and academic. So all three of those are actually different. In those evaluations, you will provide them in their preferred communication mode. At the same time, you have to pick an assessment that will measure their skills and include what we call a full and individualized education plan, FIE. Excuse me, full and individual evaluation. And the school district will complete the communication assessment prior to all of the parts of the FIE. And that will help with the person who is giving the assessment know what communication mode that will best match the student so that they will get the best results. Sometimes we've seen some of the school districts will give an FIE and then they figure out that the communication assessment afterwards, they provide that afterwards. So we try to provide that before for best practices. Are there any questions so far? I've seen some like boxes pop up for the chat, but I haven't been able to read them because they go away before I can read them.
Hey, Emily, this is Teresa. Not at this time. I dropped a couple of links on there for you. For everyone. So, but no questions at this time. Thank you.
All right, great. Yeah, I just saw them popping up, the chat box popping up, and I thought that there was a lot of questions. Just wanted to make sure. Please go to the next slide. So the FIE might identify that the student actually does have a disability and what impacts the disability on educational performance. And only the ARD committee can decide if the student needs a specially designed instruction. And that requires special education coordination services. So students have, if they have one or more disabilities, and that disability impacts their educational performance, then you have to consider the specially designed instruction. Also, we have seen this phrase, what does adversely affects the child's educational performance, and what does that mean? It's the second bubble that you see, disability adversely affects educational performance. So you have to understand that each state has to ensure that the child gets FAPE, which is fair and appropriate education. And that is available to every child, even children with disabilities. So for the need of special education services, even though the child hasn't failed any classes or they have not been held back a grade level, for example, that child still deserves FAPE. Even though I'm not failing classes, I still need services for supporting that child through their educational path. We don't look at, oh, you make nothing but C's, D's, or F's. That means you need services. If the child has a disability and makes all A's, if you determine and think, oh, they don't need services, that is wrong to think of that, because they might still need support services, because you're not looking at the whole child's functional and development academic needs. You have to look at the entire child. We don't just focus on solely academic needs. We focus also on functional needs. They might need some support in expressing themselves for self-advocacy reasons. There's just so many reasons that we need to ensure that the child gets the full access to public education, which is FAPE. Are there any questions so far?
Hey, Emily, this is Teresa. No questions. We're just dropping links into the chat box. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, go to the next slide. Now we're switching over to placement. I have a list of several things, but I did want to focus on the last one, placement, but I will briefly go over each. So the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, has a process when determining placement. The PLAF, PLAAFP, sorry, interpreter, for having to say that acronym, the PLAAFP statements. And currently, we're at the level of academic achievement and functional performance. That is what PLAAFP is. And that will be included in the description. It's their academic success and functional performance. We also have consideration of special factors. What are the goals and objectives? Supplementary aids and services, special education and related services. We have to determine and decide on all of these, but the biggest question is placement. Where is the kid going to be placed to receive said services? Next slide, please. Okay. So we have a range of potential placement options. Some kids just need one placement, and some kids can switch to different placements. It depends on their ARD committee decision of what services the student really needs. So placement is determined by the goals and objectives in the student's IEP, and they have to meet the student's academic, function, communication, and coordination needs. And we need to review the entire spectrum. We don't just focus on one area. Typically, the first placement will be general education. So we have to consider if the placement of general education, if the teachers tend to provide core instruction. The teacher of the deaf themselves if they collaborate with the gen ed teachers so that they can provide consultation services. The question in consideration from that specific placement: can appropriate educational services be provided completely in the gen ed classroom, or do we put appropriate placements such as CART, an interpreter, into that gen ed classroom? Will that child be successful with that support placement? So those are just some of the factors that we have to think about. And then if the ARG committee does decide what is an appropriate aids and services that the child needs to be successful in their gen ed classroom. So now going to the next one here, the pull out services from general education. And that's when the gen ed teacher tends to provide core instruction, and the teacher of the deaf themselves will provide resources, strategies, supports in the classroom. And they will also collaborate with the gen ed teacher as a consult. So again, the question is, can the child be successful in that placement? If so, what aids and services do they need to be successful in that placement? So that's something that you have to discuss with the ARG committee during meetings to decide what that would look like for the student. Now for the pull-out services from the gen ed classrooms, the gen ed teacher still provides core instruction, but the teacher of the deaf will provide one-on-one or a small group instruction depending on how many kids are in that placement. And they would provide more extensive instruction on the concepts that they learned in the gen ed classroom. Also, if the teacher of the deaf does still provide consult services with the gen ed teacher as well in this. For that particular placement option, you have to consider if it is appropriate for the child and what aids and services do they need to be successful. Now to the purple one, which is direct instruction in deaf education, and that's provided by the teacher of the deaf. And that is a separate placement area, and usually that is a self-contained classroom. And the teacher of the deaf must follow the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, TEKS. And they are just insane with the TEKS, but the deaf teacher will provide that instruction specifically in the self-contained classroom. And they will collaborate with gen ed teachers for consult services, because the gen ed teacher and the deaf teacher, they're both teaching the concepts in parallel, so they can consult with each other to know what they're working on for this part of the class, etc., to make sure that they are parallel and learn the same things. For that placement, you have to consider, is the child best fit in the gen ed classroom or the self-contained deaf ed classroom? If the ARG committee does decide that the self-contained deaf ed classroom is best for the student, and also they could have additional aids and services in the self-contained classroom as well. And also they might modify the curriculum. So the best practice for the placement decisions starts at the gen ed, and then you discuss all options and procedures. Some students can take specific classes in different placements. For example, we have seen deaf and hard of hearing students take a math class with push-in services. And then for reading and writing and English classes, they tend to be in the self-contained classroom. Because based on the evaluation data that we have collected, we can see where the student is best placed. And this conversation needs to happen every year because it can change year by year as they move along. And again, this is a continuum. It doesn't mean that they're stuck forever in one area. It is a continuum. It can range, it can change, whatever is the best fit for your child. Any questions about that? All right, none. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so location. We talked about placement. Now we're going to discuss location. Once the IEP has decided on placement, we have to decide on location as well. And again, this is a continuum. So starting with the home district where the student lives, can they provide that placement for the student? For example, for general education classrooms, they're usually home districts can provide that. But if we're talking about the self-contained classroom, like the deaf ed classroom, sometimes home districts cannot provide that service. So that is an example of location. So they would transfer to a district with a regional day school program for the deaf. That could be a match. Also, you have to consider the critical mass. And that means similar peers or peers similar to that student. And we have seen some families who would rather the student attend a regional day program in the gen ed classroom location because of the mass, because the kids are exposed to other children who are deaf and hard of hearing that are alike. Then another option for placement and location is Texas School for the Deaf. And that is another conversation between the school and the family to decide if that's a more appropriate consideration. And then the last one is alternative placement. And it depends on the student's needs, such as hospital or residential services. But again, this is a continuum, and it needs to be reviewed every year along with placement decisions. So communication needs. To support the students' communication needs, it is pivotal to have their full participation in the educational setting. So this is a part of the language and communication considerations. Physical, that's related to hearing loss, and speech recognition. Historical and how the child became deaf. We also want to consider technology and technology assisted. What education is, what are the implications of that? Expressive communication related to intelligibility. Language, skills, and what type of language variants. Receptivity and receptive communication. Their ability to listen or to listen with their eyes or their ears. Their listening skills, their speech and lip reading skills, if they have that ability. It's not 100% reliable to depend on lip reading, but we do have some students who can pick up and understand quite a bit through lip reading. Do we have a question?
Hi, Emily. This is Michaela. Yes, we do have a question. for students in general education setting. The question is, do home school districts have any communication and monitoring guidelines to monitor the child's progress with literacy in the general education setting?
That is a collaboration effort between the regional day school program. They do provide some services to home districts for gen ed classrooms, and they have to be able to itinerant teachers that they provide that can go and monitor that student. And it really depends on what you ask for, and then they will put that down in the IEP.
This person rephrased their question and said they actually meant their regional day school. What are the communication and monitoring guidelines to monitor that literacy success in the regional day school program?
Again, there are 53 regional day school programs, and they're all different and vary. But they should be providing the assessment to evaluate that data, to monitor literacy, to see if that student is having success. Also with HB 5845. Oh, excuse me, 548, HB 548. Also will help with the monitoring process for literacy and reading development if the family wants to assess that every year. But overall, the regional day school programs, yes, they should be monitoring that. On how they monitor that, that will vary depending on the regional day school. Okay, and then the information from parents, that is a big part of like what is going on in the home. We only know usually what's going on at school and educational settings and the students' own communications, but we do want that input from the parents, how their child communicates with the family members. That is a big component of communication needs. And also how they advocate for themselves and how they communicate, or is the child shy and scared and doesn't want to communicate their needs? That is a part of something that we're working on for the functional and development part of the child's overall picture for their needs. And parents, y'all are really the biggest part of this whole evaluation process. And then we also want to know the child's preferred communication mode. Sometimes it really varies. It depends on the situation or their mood that they're in. Sometimes I can catch myself, I would rather just sign. In other situations, I would prefer just to speak myself. And my modes of communication differ. Usually at home, I tend to sign, but when I'm with my parents, I tend to speak to them. But you can put those down because that's very important information that would help us to be able to provide different accessibility services. Any questions so far?
Emily, this is not so much a question as it is a suggestion. And this person suggested that maybe TEA could offer parent trainings specifically around guidelines and what should be taking place in each school district or each regional day school. They had suggested maybe some parent trainings in those areas.
That is actually a really good idea. If you don't mind putting that down for me and writing that down, because I have no paper or pen around. Thank you so much for that suggestion, because really we want to hear from the parents and we want to get your ideas, because that really does help us improve the life of our deaf and hard of hearing students. And then the next slide. So the last part is communication needs. We have deaf and hard of hearing supplement. And it's the art paperwork. So we need to identify the special factors on opportunities for direct communication with other students, professionals, and it's in the child's language, preferred mode of communication, excuse me. Also, we need to consider academic levels and the full range of needs need to be considered in the child's communication mode. And what do I mean by direct communication and instruction and opportunities? And that means to be able to be face-to-face with another student. How does a child communicate with another person? Not through an interpreter, but directly to another person. And we need to document. Do they gesture with the other student? Do they sign? Or if the student is oral and the other one signs, how does the communication between those two students look? How does the student communicate with adults? All possibilities and opportunities of that communication we need to document so we can have that considered in the child's communication needs. And again, I've already mentioned that sometimes communication needs are different depending on the situations. I mean, currently with COVID and the pandemic, the masks and communication needs look a lot different now. And I often catch myself when I go out into public, I don't talk as much with individuals. I tend to use my cell phone and I will type or text my information that I want to communicate and let the other individual read that. And I do have another app that will listen to what they say and type it out because I can't lip read with the masks. So my communication needs are different right now due to the pandemic and due to COVID. So we have to document all of that. The better that we document all the things, the better that we can provide services to the child and help them become, self-sufficient and that they can communicate their needs. I mean, COVID has really put us in a strange place where we have to be grateful too, because at the same time, we're seeing, so many new opportunities and new technology being developed. It really has caused us to reevaluate ourselves. And so that's one of the positive things that I can say about COVID. And so I'm trying to hang on to that and learn from that as well. So are there any questions so far? Oh, and when you receive the PowerPoint, you can click through these links here, and they are resources that you can use. For example, the last three, those are documents that we have created by the Treasury support. And that is a network through Region 11, and it is a document, and it's just available for all to use, parents, schools, it doesn't matter. Please get in there and read those documents, check them out. It also does, the last document mentions about ARD meetings, what you can bring and show at your ARD meeting. So you can ask about your child's communication needs and the assessments. So please use those and bring those to your ARD meetings. And again, I will send out that infographic when it becomes available. It's a more accessible infographic, and we also have one in Spanish. So fingers crossed that it comes out soon. Oh, it's already 1 o'clock. Oh my gosh.
I know. So we have lots of people who are commenting, thanking you for your time today. They also want to make sure that they're on the email list to receive the follow-up PowerPoint. So I'll make sure you do get that. So another question here from one of the attendees about one of their children having received the SSES account, but the other of her child having not. And she sent in the application on the same day. Should she email you individually to get more information, or how should you email you, Emily?
Yes, yes, email me, or you can send me that email and I will contact and get the status on that. You should have gotten both of it at the same time if one was approved and the other one. But again, we only have 3 people that are working on that, so I'm not sure exactly how they have split up the workload, but I will definitely tap them on the shoulder and ask.
Awesome. Well, let me make sure there aren't any more questions. Okay, perfect. Everyone's thanking you for your time. We also want to thank you for your time, Emily. Thank you also for our interpreter and our cart provider. I will follow up with everyone who signed up for today's webinar with a copy of the PowerPoint, which will include all of the links in a nice, neat place for you, as well as Emily's contact information. The links were also provided by Teresa in the chat box, so they are there. So we do encourage you to take that survey to get involved in that group that Emily is a part of, looking to have parent support in that group. So please, I encourage you all to do that. Thank you again for your presentation today, Emily. And we look forward to working with you in the future. And thank you for what you do for families and our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.